It was supposed to be a quiet stop, nothing more than a bottle of water and a protein bar on a muggy afternoon near the edge of town, where the traffic thinned and the air smelled like concrete and pine. But when Chief Petty Officer Alexandria, Lex Ward, recently retired from the Navy, stepped into the suburban convenience store near the perimeter of Bristow Ridge, no one knew that history had just walked through the door, clad in faded jeans, combat boots worn from actual battle, and a plain black tee under a lightweight jacket. She moved with quiet purpose, her presence calm, even distant, as if she were always scanning for exits, threats, angles. But to the store owner, a red-faced man with a chip on his shoulder and a lockbox of bias behind the register, she wasn't a decorated veteran or one of the most lethal snipers in the history of U.S. military operations. No, to him she was simply suspicious, a black woman, with too much focus and not enough smile, and with a frown he pressed the silent alarm and muttered something into the phone, and before Lex could even reach the back cooler, 2 squad cars screeched to a halt outside like it was a robbery in progress, and Officers Jenkins and Laramie entered with puffed chests and eyes already narrowed, demanding she show ID before she even realized they were talking to her. Calmly, clearly, she explained who she was, handed over her valid military-issued ID, but Jenkins barely glanced at it before scoffing, "Fake. Nice try." And Laramie added, "You people always have a story," as if her 20 years of service were a costume. Her pulse didn't rise, not yet, because she had been here before, not exactly like this, but in other ways, on missions deep behind enemy lines where being underestimated was the first move and patience was the only countermeasure. And in her mind, images flashed, her rifle braced against her shoulder in a sandstorm outside Mosul, the whisper of wind before a confirmed shot at 200 meters, the screams of civilians silenced by her precise intervention. Because she hadn't just served, she had excelled. Known across units as the Ghost, she had saved commanders who would never know her name, made impossible calls in dead air, held her breath through impossible wind shears to protect lives from afar. But now here she was, handcuffed on the sidewalk of a gas station by men who didn't even run her name, whose ego came faster than any reason. Her wrists pinched, her silence deafening, because she knew any sudden movement could become a headline, and she refused to give them that power. So she waited, stoic, even as people walked by and stared, phones in hand, the murmurs growing. What did she do? Is she dangerous? And all she could do was bite down the injustice and think of how many times she'd been the unseen line between safety and death for strangers who would never know her sacrifice. Jenkins kept questioning her like an interrogator, like she was the lie and his assumptions were truth, accusing her of impersonating a military officer, waving her ID in the air like a prop, unaware that the number on it flagged federal clearance and embedded encryption. And all the while the store owner stood behind the glass smirking like he had done his patriotic duty by reporting a threat, while in reality he had just insulted the very freedom he claimed to support. Lex could have named names, called contacts, ended it all in seconds, but something deeper in her made her wait. Let the system reveal itself in raw form, unfiltered, because it wasn't just about her. It was about every soldier who came home, only to find suspicion instead of gratitude, disrespect instead of honor. And while she sat in the back of the squad car, memories surfaced uninvited. Her squad pinned down in Kandahar, her voice calmly directing air support under fire, the child she carried across rubble in Aleppo after her team had been ambushed, the folded flags she delivered to families with trembling hands, telling them their sons and daughters were heroes, while she bore the guilt of surviving, all of it, every trauma, every medal, every mission, now reduced to this: suspicion. In a small-town parking lot, for the crime of being calm and black and alone. The worst part wasn't even the cuffs or the stares. It was that no one cared to ask, to verify, to believe she could be what she was. And as the cruiser rolled toward the station, Lex closed her eyes and slowed her breathing. Not because she was afraid, but because every cell in her body was trained for war, and she refused to let these men draw it out of her on American soil. She didn't know it yet, but across town, a young army medic who'd served alongside her once, barely surviving thanks to Lex's cover fire, recognized her while driving by the scene, and immediately called her superior, who then escalated the call all the way to Washington, where a single name on a whiteboard sent a chill through the halls of the Pentagon. Chief Petty Officer Alexandria Ward, detained by local authorities for impersonating herself, and the man who read the message, a four-star general who owed Lex his son's life, was already reaching for his jacket and his driver. Because if there was one thing he couldn't tolerate, it was this country turning its back on its warriors. And by the time the squad car pulled into the station, it wasn't just local politics anymore. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The squad car reeked of stale coffee and smug ignorance as Lex sat cuffed in the back seat, wrists aching against hard plastic restraints, her gaze fixed forward, while Officers Jenkins and Laramie continued their pitiful performance of mockery, the car rolling lazily toward the precinct like they had just bagged a real threat, not a national asset. "So you're a sniper, huh?" Jenkins muttered with a snort, not bothering to look back. "What did you shoot soda cans at the fair? Or you just play Call of Duty and started believing your own hype?" Laramie chuckled, adding, "Bet she's never even held a real weapon, let alone fired one." The kind of cowardly laughter born not from humor but from the insecurity of men who had never stood for anything real, never seen a comrade fall in their arms, never learned the difference between authority and honor. Lex didn't respond, didn't flinch. Her silence was louder than any words, and in it was the weight of 20 years of elite service, of confirmed kills that had saved entire squads, of black ops missions that weren't even acknowledged by the Pentagon but changed the course of conflicts. Her breath steady, heart slower than theirs because she'd trained for sniper duty with a discipline that stripped away ego, fear, and impulse, leaving only purpose, calculation, and control. But far from the cruiser, across town at Fort Granger, something else had begun to move. Word had spread fast after a low-ranking Army medic, Sergeant Eli Moreno, spotted Lex being shoved into the back seat and recognized her face instantly. Not because she was famous, but because he owed her his life, and seeing her in cuffs like that made his stomach twist. He had served beside her in a covert joint task force in northern Syria, where one of her shots from nearly 1,500 meters out had taken out a mortar team moments before they would have obliterated his convoy. He didn't think, he just called his CO, who then punched in a number few ever used, and when that call climbed, the chain of command, her name hit ears that had no tolerance for disrespect toward warfighters, especially her. Within 30 minutes, the base commander, Colonel Janice Pike, stormed into the command center. Phone pressed to her ear, her boots striking the floor like gunshots. "You're sure it's her?" she barked to the senior NCO on the line, who confirmed it again. Yes, Chief Petty Officer Alexandria Ward, detained in town on suspicion of impersonating military personnel. No, they didn't verify her ID, and yes, they handcuffed her in broad daylight. Colonel Pike's blood ran cold, not out of fear, but because she knew the implications. Lex Ward wasn't just any sniper. She was a legend in the ranks, the kind of operator who got called when missions went sideways, the kind of woman who trained SEALs how to breathe in dead space before a kill shot, who rescued a downed pilot in Marawi under full fire with only a knife and her instincts, the one who had walked into enemy territory in full night gear just to extract a squad pinned for days. Pike knew she had to escalate fast, and so she did, calling her contact at Northcom, who didn't wait either. Within minutes, high brass had been alerted, and General Augustus Layton, 4-star commander of Special Operations Command, received the call as he was exiting a meeting in D.C., only to stop cold when he heard the name Ward Alexandria. His breath hitched, because years ago, during a botched hostage extraction in Yemen, it was Lex who had found his son, a young Marine Corps comm specialist trapped behind rebel lines, bleeding out from shrapnel. She had dragged him through a mile of hostile terrain, neutralizing threats one by one, and when the medevac came, she disappeared before anyone could even thank her. General Layton had tried to commend her, but she had declined the medal, stating, "I didn't do it for ribbons, sir." So when he heard she'd been handcuffed by small-town officers too ignorant to check a database or show an ounce of respect, something in him snapped. Not rage, not vengeance, but resolve. He made one call to his personal aide, "Prep the jet. I'm going to Bristow Ridge now." And while the skies cleared over the eastern seaboard back in town, the store manager, an oily man named Pritchard, refused to hand over security, footage to the responding military base liaison, claiming it's a civilian matter, and she didn't look like no soldier, standing behind a locked counter, his arrogance evident, until Colonel Pike herself arrived in full uniform, flanked by MPs and a legal officer, her voice like stone. "Release the footage or we'll seize it under federal order." But even as he stalled, news had begun to leak online, thanks to a passerby's shaky phone footage showing Lex being pushed into the cruiser, and the look on her face. Not angry, not afraid, but dignified, wounded only by the stupidity of the system she had spent her life defending. The video went viral within an hour, and comments poured in from veterans, active duty personnel, and citizens alike. "I served with her in Fallujah. She's the real deal. That woman trained our sniper school. I can't believe this. This is how we treat our heroes." And the nation began to stir before the cops even realized what they'd done. But inside the squad car, Lex remained still, unshaken, thinking not about the humiliation, but about the bigger picture, because she understood this wasn't about her pride. This was about forcing the country to look in the mirror, about exposing the layers of assumption and dismissal that so often covered the faces of black veterans, especially women whose service was invisible until someone bled. So she waited, quiet, her spine a rod of steel, because justice wasn't coming with lights and sirens. It was coming by jet, by stars on the shoulder, by a man she once saved who now carried enough weight to bring the world to a halt. The precinct was quiet when they brought Lex inside, the kind of silence that settled over a building just before it erupted. Officer Jenkins walked with exaggerated confidence, hand gripping Lex's arm like he had just pulled her from a battlefield, unaware how ironic that really was, while Laramie followed behind, smirking at the reception clerk as if he were delivering a national threat rather than one of the nation's most elite defenders. They didn't know that the storm was already on its way, traveling at 600 knots aboard a Gulfstream jet, designated for only the highest military brass, with General Layton reviewing Lex's full record on a secure tablet, each page a chronicle of valor, tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, classified operations in zones that didn't exist on maps, Bronze Stars, Navy commendations, citations from special ops units that rarely put anything in writing, yet none of those ribbons, none of those acts had spared her from the humiliation, now unfolding in a fluorescent-lit holding room where Jenkins mocked her with every breath, leaning back in a chair with his boots on the desk, saying, "I've met your kind before. Always think you're too good to be questioned," as if she hadn't spent years defending the right of clueless men like him to spout nonsense. Laramie chimed in with casual venom. "People like you always pulling the military card. Just say you got caught lying and we can let you go with a fine." And Lex, seated calmly, didn't respond, her eyes fixed not on them, but on the clock. On the wall, each tick a reminder that the truth was drawing closer, that the reckoning was en route. She didn't need to argue, because her reputation would speak louder than her words ever could. And sure enough, less than 30 minutes later, the sound of black SUVs pulling into the precinct's parking lot triggered a subtle shift in the air, a disturbance in the arrogance as General Layton stepped out in full-dress uniform, his presence like a blade slicing through fog, flanked by military police, aides, and a legal officer, his face unreadable, but his jaw tight, his eyes, storming with fury, kept barely in check. When he entered the precinct, the front desk sergeant stammered, "Can I help you?" To which the general replied with cool steel, "You will direct me to the officer who detained Chief Petty Officer Alexandria Ward. Now." And the weight of his stars caused the room to freeze. Suddenly, phones were put down, postures shifted, and the careless swagger of bureaucracy began to erode. Jenkins, still oblivious, chuckled when the door opened to reveal the general, rising slowly like he was greeting a lost tourist. "Can I help you, sir?" But his grin faded the instant Layton's voice landed. "You are dismissed. Step away from her. Now." And for the first time that day, Jenkins looked unsure, his arrogance faltering as the full force of military presence began to eclipse his narrow world. Lex stood up, calm, but something in her posture had changed. There was fire behind her stillness now, not just discipline, but quiet vindication, as General Layton turned to her and without hesitation saluted. "Chief Ward, on behalf of the United States Armed Forces, I apologize for this disgraceful treatment. You deserve better. This will not stand." And the room seemed to contract around his words, as even Laramie's face drained of color, the realization hitting like a slap. They hadn't detained a fake. They had arrested a living legend. The general turned toward the stunned officers, his voice cutting through the room. "You not only failed to verify her identity using even the most basic procedures, but you dishonored a woman who has done more for this country than any of you will ever understand." He walked forward, placing her file down on the table. "Read it, if you can comprehend it. This is who you arrested. A combat sniper with over 200 confirmed kills, most during operations so classified your little Google searches wouldn't touch the surface." Laramie stammered something about doing their job, but Layton's glare silenced him. "Your job is to protect and serve, not assume and disgrace." And with that, he turned back to Lex and said softly, "You're coming with me now. I've already contacted base security and your legal representation. We'll be filing formal charges of civil rights violations, and I assure you, this will reach every corner it needs to." As Lex nodded, saying nothing, simply walking past Jenkins and Laramie with the same poise she'd walked off the battlefield. With the difference now being, the building was suddenly aware it had just embarrassed itself in front of a war hero. Outside, reporters had begun to gather, tipped off by social media, and the image of the general holding the car door for Lex as she entered the SUV became the viral symbol of a deeper rot. That someone who had shielded this country with deadly precision could be treated like a criminal based on skin color and assumption, while the men responsible couldn't even spell her rank correctly. As the convoy pulled away inside the precinct, chaos erupted. Phones rang, calls from the mayor's office, from Pentagon liaisons, from local and national press, all asking the same thing. "Did you really handcuff a Navy sniper?" And, no matter how they answered, the damage was already done, not just to the department's image, but to the illusion of fairness it had tried to project. Because Lex's silence, her refusal to lash out, had forced them to confront themselves. And that was far more terrifying than any weapon she'd ever held. The fallout was swift, searing and unstoppable, like a controlled detonation that the department never saw coming until the blast had already consumed them. Within hours of the footage of General Layton saluting Chief Petty Officer Alexandria Lex Ward hitting the airwaves, national news networks ran breaking segments detailing not only the incident, but her extraordinary military record, interviews emerging from former teammates, commanders, and even foreign allies who testified to her precision, leadership, and sacrifice. "She saved my unit in Helmand," said one retired Marine on CNN, his voice shaking with reverence, while another former SEAL described her as the calm in chaos, the one you begged for when things went dark. And amid that rising chorus of honor, the Bristow Ridge Police Department found itself drowning in public backlash. Calls jammed the lines. Protesters appeared outside its headquarters, waving signs like "Respect Black Veterans," and "Her silence was stronger than your badges." And even members of Congress began tweeting support for Lex, calling for oversight, reform, and accountability. Officer Jenkins and Laramie, once smug behind their badges, now hid from cameras and deleted their social media accounts as their past behavior came under scrutiny. Internal Affairs launching a rapid investigation not just into Lex's detainment, but into complaints from other black and brown citizens who had been mistreated, ignored, or falsely accused under their watch. And while the department issued a shallow press statement referring to it as a regretful incident, General Layton held a televised press conference outside Fort Granger, standing with Lex at his side in full uniform, declaring with unmistakable conviction, "This is not about one woman. This is about what happens when we allow arrogance and bias to go unchecked. This Chief Petty Officer has given more to this country than most of us will ever understand, and she was repaid with disrespect and dismissal. We will not let that stand. Not under my command. Not under this flag." And as the crowd behind him erupted in applause, Lex said nothing. her face composed but her eyes reflecting the quiet storm that had raged beneath for so long. Behind the scenes, high-level federal officials began preparing a full review of Bristow Ridge PD's practices, the mayor privately offering Lex an apology, which she acknowledged but did not accept. "Apologies are easy," she told him. "Change is not." And true to her word, she worked with national veterans groups and civil rights attorneys to launch a new initiative designed to protect minority veterans from discrimination in civilian life, her experience now the catalyst for legislation being drafted under the Ward Protocol, a federal policy that would require law enforcement agencies to receive updated training on identifying military credentials, de-escalation for decorated veterans, and racial sensitivity rooted in real consequence. Lex never sought revenge, only responsibility. And when the Civilian Review Board finally issued its report weeks later, it named Jenkins and Laramie directly, citing gross negligence, procedural misconduct, and racial bias. Both officers dishonorably discharged from the force while the police chief quietly resigned, his legacy forever tied to the day. His department handcuffed a sniper who had taken more risks for freedom than he ever would. But the story didn't end in shame. It ended in ceremony. A special session convened at Arlington National Cemetery, where leaders from all branches of the military gathered not to mourn, but to honor the living, as Lex was awarded a rare and prestigious civilian commendation for courage, composure, and leadership beyond the battlefield. Standing at the podium, Lex finally spoke to the world, not about what had been done to her, but about what she believed must be done next. "I didn't wear this uniform for applause. I wore it because I believed in what it stood for. But that belief doesn't stop at the battlefield. It means we hold each other accountable at home, too. If we say we value service, then we must show it, not just to the ones who look like heroes in the movies, but to the ones you walk past in parking lots, the ones who don't brag, don't boast, but carry the weight of service in silence, because the moment we forget them is the moment we forget ourselves." And the silence that followed was different than the silence in the police cruiser weeks ago. It was respectful, reverent, the kind that comes when a nation sees a person, truly sees them, for the first time, not as an assumption, not as a threat, but as a truth too long overlooked. And when General Layton stood beside her again, no cameras this time, just one soldier to another, he offered no apology, only these words: "You stood taller than anyone ever needed you to, and we see you now, fully, finally." Lex nodded, her eyes forward, not seeking validation but peace, because she knew this was never just her fight. It was for every service member who came home and found they had to keep fighting just to be seen.